So first off, you might notice that I'm not wearing a hat. One of the rare occasions where that is not happening. I don't know, I didn't feel like going to grab one. But this video is not about my lack of a hat, not about my bald head. This video is about the fact that the Vice President of the United States, JD Vance, appears for all intents and purposes to be a Klansman. And I don't say that lightly. That isn't just an idle insult to throw out at someone who I admittedly do not like.
This guy's a little pig man. He's a little pig man.
This is a straightforward description of the content of the speech he gave at the Turning Points USA conference yesterday. Before we get to that, though, I first want to talk a little bit about Vance as a political figure. So he makes his way onto the stage about 10 years ago on the account of the publication of his book, Hillbilly Elegy, which was later adapted into a not particularly successful film.
You gotta take care of business, you gotta go to school, you gotta get good grades to even have a chance.
Mom was the best in her class. What's the point?
I'm talking about a chance.
The whole thesis of Hillbilly Elegy, if you could call it that, is simply that the people from whence JD Vance comes, the working class, lower class, poor of Appalachia, suffer from cultural deficiency that render them essentially unable to function in the modern world. And although there are larger forces at work that have harmed them, it's primarily a cultural problem, pathology. And the story of the book is a story of Vance escaping this pathology into the world of the elites. After Trump won in 2016, this book emerged as kind of an explanation of the Trump voter. Of course, the typical Trump voter is not actually a poor person in Appalachia. The typical Trump voter is a solidly middle-class person in one of the suburbs of a purple state or a red state or whatever, but that's a separate point. Hillbilly Elegy was presented as his explanation for Trump, and Vance as the kind of spokesperson for these people who can speak the language of elites. And at the time, he was a critic of Trump. He was a major critic of Trump.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
It makes you think that at a fundamental level, this is sort of a he said, she said, right? And at the end of the day, do you believe Donald Trump, who always tells the truth? Just kidding. Or do you believe that woman on that tape?
No, I cannot stand Trump because I think he's a fraud. Well, I think he's a total fraud that is exploiting these people, who is a total fraud.
Like you said, I agree with you on Trump because I don't think that he's the person. I don't think he actually cares about folks.
Definitely, there is definitely an element of Donald Trump support that has its basis in racism or xenophobia.
I think there's a chance, if I feel like Trump has a really good chance of winning, that I might have to hold my nose and vote for Hillary Clinton. I think that I'm going to vote third party because I can't stomach Trump. I think that he's noxious and is leading the white working class to a very dark place.
Friends even said that Vance called Trump Hitler. I mean, that's not a light thing to throw at someone, right? He said Trump might be America's Hitler. And so that's Vance in 2016. 2017 to an extent. But then as it becomes clear that Trump is the Republican Party, as it becomes clear that the only pathway into Republican politics is through Trump, Vance makes an about-face. He changes gears. He goes from being Trump critic to something close to MAGA's strongest soldier. We first saw this new Vance in the Ohio Senate race in 2022. See this now as he rode that positioning all the way to the vice presidential nomination in 2024 and now to the vice presidency of the United States. Now, part of Vance's political transformation is also an ideological transformation. He is not simply a conservative. He's one of these national conservatives, a part of the populist right. And kind of at the foundation of Vance's particular iteration of this is a, for lack of a better term, blood and soil vision of American citizenship and American identity. He has been quite clear about this. He outlined a version of this in the speech accepting the Republican nomination for vice president last year.
Now, in that cemetery, there are people who were born around the time of the Civil War. And if, as I hope, my wife and I are eventually laid to rest there, and our kids follow us, there will be 7 generations just in that small mountain cemetery plot in eastern Kentucky. 7 generations of people who have fought for this country, who have built this country, who have made things in this country, and who would fight and die to protect this country if they were asked to. Now, that's not just an idea, my friends. That's not just a set of principles, even though the ideas and the principles are great. That is a homeland. That is our homeland.
And as recently as this summer, he articulated this vision.
If you think about it, identifying America just with agreeing with the principles, let's say, of the Declaration of Independence, that's a definition that is way over-inclusive and under-inclusive at the same time. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, it would include hundreds of millions, maybe billions of foreign citizens who agree with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Must we admit all of them tomorrow? If you follow that logic of America as a purely creedal nation, America purely as an idea, that is where it would lead you.
In this vision, the United States is not what you would call a creedal nation, a nation where it doesn't really matter where you come from or your particular origins in the country itself. What matters is your commitment to the ideals of the Declaration and of the Constitution and of American democracy. This is the vision of the United States that Abraham Lincoln championed in the Gettysburg Address. It is the vision of the United States that inspired the Civil Rights Movement. It's the vision of the United States that was the ideological backbone of our crusade against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan during the Second World War.
They know that victory for us means victory for freedom. They know that victory for us means victory for the institution of democracy, the ideal of the family, the simple principles of common decency and humanity.
And one does not have to ignore the many, many flaws and problems and challenges that the United States has, nor does one have to ignore its often disreputable conduct on the world stage to acknowledge that this vision of the creedal America is exceptionally powerful, and is arguably the only way a country that has always been diverse and pluralistic and quite fractious could ever unify as a singular nation. But Vance rejects this. Vance's view is that the degree of your Americanness is entirely tied to your heritage in this country. And although this is ostensibly a non-racial thing, for example, your humble neighborhood New York Times columnist has a family history that stretches well back into the 19th century on account of the fact that I'm a descendant of enslaved people. It's quite clear that for Vance, and that for other people who share this notion of a heritage Americanness, that it's not actually racially inclusive, but quite exclusive. It's a kind of another way of tying American identity and American citizenship to whiteness, and not even the kind of narrow whiteness that you might have seen among early 20th century eugenicists and nativists, who were also kind of obsessed with this, who insisted the United States was a Nordic country and only those of German and English origins could really count as true Americans. That at least is somewhat coherent. No, this vision is actually kind of inclusive of Europe as a civilization. And there's a lot to say about this notion of European civilization as a coherent thing, and I'll do a video at another point about why I think the United States is actually not a part of European civilization in that way, and that Americans in the 18th and 19th century did not see themselves in that way either, but that's a separate conversation. This is just this notion of heritage is inclusive of much of Europe, which means that because much of Europe doesn't have the kind of long-standing origins in this country as, say, the descendants of African slaves or Native American people, or even people who were part of what was formerly Mexico in Texas and California and New Mexico, the only way you can understand this definition of heritage, this definition of roots, is if it's racial. So that's Vance. That's where Vance stands. But I don't want to get too caught up in Vance's ideological views, because I think the thing to know about him is he'll kind of say essentially anything if it's going to get him to power and authority. See his transition from Trump critic to, again, MAGA's strongest soldier. It's hard to say that he has any principles beyond whatever that will help him climb the ladder of power, whatever will help him get even closer to the pinnacle of American politics, which is the presidency. And it's clear Vance is determined, either because these are the waters in which he swims, or because of a studied calculation or whatever, that the pathway for him to power is through the most gutter demagoguery and bigotry that you can kind of imagine. You saw it last year when he essentially whipped up a blood libel against the Haitian immigrant community of Springfield, Ohio. His constituents, mind you, accusing them of stealing their neighbors' pets and eating them, and then when confronted on this, insisting that it is his right to make up stories to get people's attention to what he sees are real problems, in this case, the existence of an ethnic minority that he doesn't like.
The American media totally ignored this stuff until Donald Trump and I started talking about cat memes. If I have to,
But it
if
wasn't
I have
just a
to
meme,
create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that's what I'm going to do, Dana.
And his performance at the Turning Point conference yesterday is another example of this. At this Turning Point conference, he basically went on a hate rant. Of course, it wasn't a rant, it was a studied speech, which makes it even worse. Jokes and asides, but all meant to communicate that there's an in-group and an out-group, and the out-group consists of people who don't look like you. The out-group consists of people, in this speech, I'm not exaggerating, who look like me. Here are some highlights from that speech.
And in the meantime, what are the Democrats offering you in the meantime? I got to say, ladies and gentlemen, they are not sending their best. Omar Fateh was Ilhan Omar's candidate for mayor of Mogadishu. Minneapolis. Little Freudian slip there. And Jasmine Crockett. Oh, Jasmine Crockett. The record speaks for itself. She wants to be a senator, though her street girl persona is about as real as her nails.
Unless you think I'm really exaggerating about the extent to which this speech was just an open declaration of white nationalism, this is one of the things he says during it.
In the United States of America, you don't have to apologize for being white anymore.
I'm sure Vance imagines himself as almost a Reagan-like figure, someone capable of talking to the troglodytes as much as the people in the C-suites. But this kind of language, even Reagan would have shied away from. This kind of language, even George Wallace would have shied away from. George Wallace, not the comedian, but George Wallace, the Alabama politician who sort of pioneered the kind of racial resentment populist politics that is quite influential in the moment.
We are defending the right of the people of Virginia and of Alabama to decide some questions for themselves.
George Wallace, his heyday was in the 1960s, in the 64, 68, and 72 presidential elections, and he almost threw the election into the House in 68. If you want to read more about Wallace, the best book on him, I think, is The Politics of Rage, George Wallace, The Origins of the New Conservatism and the Transformation of American Politics by Dan T. Carter. This is a wonderful book and will teach you a great deal, not just about Wallace and Nixon, but about American politics in the 60s. So highly recommend this if you want to know more about George Wallace. You can also, if you're not so inclined to read a whole tome, read Dan T. Carter's much slimmer volume From George Wallace to Newt Gingrich, Race in the Conservative Counter-Revolution, 1963 to 1994, another great book. No, Vance is neither Reagan nor Wallace. He's not as politically skilled as this man. He's actually kind of off-putting. He has a churlishness, a smugness that comes through in all of his public appearances. If Vance is similar to anyone, it is David Duke, who in the late 80s and early 90s was a literal Klansman trying to make his way into Republican politics, first as a state lawmaker and then in a run for governor. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that Vance sounds almost exactly like Duke.
There's nothing wrong with white people being proud of theirs. I think Jesse Jackson's proud of his people. I want to preserve the heritage of my society. I love the Western Christian civilization that we live in. And I'm concerned about the fact that we seem to be losing some of that heritage.
The only thing that has truly served as an anchor of the United States of America is that we have been, and by the grace of God, we always will be, a Christian nation.
But even unlike Duke, Vance is not shying away from the seedy underbelly of his political movement. That's in part because that seedy underbelly, led by people like Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens, is no longer the underbelly. It's the mainstream of at least the younger part of the Republican Party. And Vance is making a studied calculation that he can ride this energy, this reactionary, bigoted energy that's explicitly opposed to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. It's explicitly opposed to the notion of the United States as an inclusive creedal nation. Vance thinks he can ride the energy to the White House, ride the energy to the presidency, ride the energy to the very top, where then maybe he'll perhaps fill the gaping hole that clearly exists in his soul, the gaping hole that has led him to completely contort his entire self in pursuit of power. Maybe he can accomplish that. Maybe I'm just being naive or too optimistic, but I think someone that viscerally unpleasant isn't going to get just as far as he hopes to. But we'll see. We'll see.